In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Hi everyone, my name is Lydia and I will discuss how regulatory and voluntary governance frameworks affect environmental management and if they compete with or complement each other. Governments may seem like a dry topic, but I think it is essential to our learning. I will discuss these frameworks in relation to the forestry industry. Governance is not the same as government. Governance includes the actions of government, but also encompasses communities, businesses, and non-government organisations. Environmental governance can be, and is often, both regulatory and voluntary. Regulatory frameworks are the various regulatory processes and organisations through which political figures influence environmental actions and outcomes. Voluntary frameworks of environmental governance are voluntary agreements negotiated to meet environmental targets, such as lower waste regeneration emissions or higher energy efficiency. Entities may choose to undergo voluntary assessments to get better prices for their products, to improve their public image, and to achieve social and environmental goals. Additionally, adopting a voluntary framework can be a strategy to preempt legal regulation. It can therefore be argued that existing policies and regulations are crucial to the emergence and effectiveness of voluntary frameworks. It has been argued that without regulatory leadership, voluntary agreements can be weak or misleading. Additionally, many corporate and industry sectors are often apprehensive about implementing voluntary assessments or agreements because these assessments can be biased and costly. Perhaps you have heard about the many court cases involving the word biodegradable and greenwashing marketing strategies. In the USA, the Federal Trade Commission charged Tender Corp for claiming its bathroom wipes were biodegradable. The Federal Trade Commission said the term can only be used if companies have scientific evidence that their product will completely decompose within a reasonably short period of time under customary methods of disposal. Since the wipes usually end up in landfills or elsewhere, they are not likely to biodegrade within a reasonably short time, the FTC said. This is a good example of how a company created a voluntary framework in its business, but was sanctioned for breaking regulations. So do regulatory and voluntary frameworks compete with or complement each other? I think it is determined by perception. Tender Corp would argue that regulations competed against their business, but as a consumer, I think they are complementary. I see a business trying to create better products for the environment voluntarily, and a regulatory force ensuring that the actions taken by the business are legitimate. But what does the literature say? A conclusion broadly supported by existing evidence is that there is a clear relationship between governments and the groups within governance as previously mentioned. Governments are the source of credible threats of regulatory action that would require expensive compliance, and this encourages the adoption of voluntary agreements on environmental standards. Because environmental governance includes both government, various groups, stakeholders, and deals with socio-environmental problems, we are clearly dealing with a complex adaptive system. Some literature suggests that voluntary frameworks perform poorly in dealing with complexity due to their tendency to ignore the intended and unintended consequences of their behaviour for others. Let's assess a case study closer to home. Australia has a well-established framework to support the conservation and sustainable management of forests. Forest policy in Australia is developed and implemented at the national and state levels. However, state governments are primarily responsible. The states establish minimum standards and are enforced with regulatory action. However, there are two major voluntary global forest certification bodies recognised in Australia. They are the Forest Stewardship Council and the Programme for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, or PEFC, represented by Responsible Wood in Australia. The PEFC is implemented through two separate but linked processes: Sustainable Forest Management Certification and Chain of Custody Certification. Sustainable Forest Management Certification assures that forests are managed in line with challenging environmental, social, and economic requirements. Chain of Custody Certification tracks forest-based products from sustainable sources to the final product. It demonstrates that each step of the supply chain is closely monitored through independent auditing to ensure that unsustainable sources are excluded. You can find the list of certified forestry businesses on Responsible Wood's website. As a consumer, you can easily look out for logos to ensure that you are purchasing sustainable products. You can find it on things like paper products, furniture, and building materials. Successful voluntary governments is a framework that involves a variety of people, including consumers, wholesalers, and industry. I mentioned previously that governance encompasses the actions of everyone. PEFC relies on stakeholder and community contribution to ensure that its standards meet public expectation. People can join working groups, which are an integral part to developing national standards for certification. The standards include balancing harvest and growth rates to ensure a forest's capacity to store and sequester carbon are safeguarded. The PEFC certification is a great voluntary framework businesses and consumers can utilize. This is a good example of how regulatory and voluntary frameworks can be complementary, especially if an elected government does not prioritize environmental policy. Ideally, the regulations imposed by the government create sustainable benchmarks for industry. The option for voluntary accreditation creates additional value, demand for sustainable products, and builds consumer trust. Most importantly, the combination of the frameworks helps to establish sustainability, and their existence is evidence that industries are beginning to prioritize environmental governance. Unfortunately, some literature suggests that this can harm suppliers who need the most support. Suppliers in developing countries that are not supported by regulations often don't meet requirements for voluntary assessments because they can't afford them or don't meet labour requirements. It has been recommended to extend voluntary frameworks to include social services, finding new approaches to development issues, and working with unions and NGOs. Additionally, is the combination of voluntary and regulatory frameworks enough? Sometimes the threat of sanctions doesn't seem to be enough to deter companies from breaching regulation. After third-party voluntary assessment, how often are they reassessed? For example, the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales is certified with Responsible Wood and PEFC, yet they have been logging illegally. I hope that my presentation has helped you understand environmental governance and the complex relationships between voluntary and regulatory frameworks. I look forward to seeing you in the discussion forum to discuss this topic further.